we're going to go through some of the legislation today as it relates to transition services. And so, of course, we're going to start with PL 94-142 from 1975, which really goes back to the whole idea that students in special education will receive a free and appropriate public education. That's often referred to as FAPE. Due process when it comes to any sort of disciplinary actions or even due process when it comes to receiving services for their disability. The idea of individualized education programs, and that's where the transition services really kind of sit, if you will. All those transition services are written into a student's IEP, so it's very individualized for each of them. And the least restrictive environment, which ensures that a student is being educated alongside their gen ed and typically performing peers as much as possible. So this starts our framework when we're looking at the legislation that has kind of come into play and changed over the years for transition services. So in 1990, we saw a reauthorization of IDEA. And at that point in 1990, what IDEA said was that each student was going to be required to have at no later than the age of 16 an individual transition plan. And that individual transition plan was going to be part of the student's IEP. That plan was going to allow for kind of a coordinated set of activities and interagency linkages, and it was really designed to promote the student's movement to post-school opportunities and functions like independent living, vocational training, and any sort of additional educational experiences, whether that was a trade school, vocational school, community college, four-year university, etc. In 1990, there was really an expanded scope of the related services that were going to be provided, and so the social work was added in 1990 in terms of related services, as well as rehabilitation counseling. So both of those became embedded within the process of the individual transition plan. So there was also a lot of discussion at that point about what was going to happen once students graduate. And IDEA in 1990, that reauthorization was really pushed by parents. It was parents who were looking to make those changes and figure out what was going to happen to their students after they graduated. And you have to remember that back in 1970s, oftentimes students who had pretty severe disabilities were institutionalized. So then by 1990, you have a new era of parents who have, 18, 19, 20-year-olds who, at the time that they were born may have been institutionalized in, the previous generations. That wasn't happening anymore. So it was kind of a whole new world of what do we do now? So in 1997, we had another reauthorization of IDEA, and at this point we really see a lot more of the parent involvement kind of incorporated into the actual law. A lot of the educational results were increased, or the expectations were increased for students, especially students with more severe disabilities. And two things really, the two biggies that changed in 1997 was that transition planning went from the age of 16 to the age of 14. So now instead of starting the planning at 16 in 1997, it was written into the law that it was going to happen at 14. The other thing that was really stressed was not just goals, but also doing some of those objectives that you often see in IEPs with students with more severe disabilities. And really the push was also to use benchmarks and measurable goals. I mean, that was a huge emphasis in 1997. So transition planning in that new legislation really focused on a couple of very concrete tasks, and that was figuring out the living arrangements, if the student was going to live independently or in some sort of group home, some sort of post-secondary employment, whether that was going to be working in some sort of kind of factory line, if you will, or in retail, whatever that may be, developing some independent and community living skills. And those might include things like being able to navigate the local bus system or the metro, being able to ride that independently, or go to the bank and cash a check. Those are examples of those independent living skills. And in addition to that, there was a push and emphasis on post-secondary education. So going into community college or trade schools in order to have additional opportunities for education after high school. And remember, when we're talking about these particular students, these students can stay in the public school setting until their 22nd birthday. So they can start school at 21, but once they turn 22, they can finish the school year, but that would be the end of the time that they can spend within the public school system. So oftentimes you're not looking at necessarily 18-year-olds in all situations. That may be the case for more high incidence disabilities, so students with learning disabilities, students with emotional behavioral disabilities, but for some of our students with more severe disabilities, whether that's severe and profound, intellectual disabilities, or some of our students with autism, those students may continue to stay in a public school program until they are 22. So again, through time, we work our way up to 2004 where we have a new authorization, and you really see a refinement about what transition is and what we're going to provide for students. So I'm not going to read this to you, but I think it's important to recognize that as time's going on, we're kind of adding to what's important for students outside of the school setting. So whereas we may have just been talking initially about, we need to figure out where these students are going to work after they finish high school, or what kind of post-secondary opportunities there are. Now we're starting to look at the big picture in terms of where do these students fit within society. So we can't just say they're going to kind of live in this bubble and this is all we need to focus on. You do really see an expansion of the transition definitions. What's important to note about 2004 is that transition services go back to the age of 16. So we started at 16. We moved in 1997 to the age of 14, and now by 2004 we're realizing 14 might be too young, so let's look at 16 again. So that's another piece of the puzzle here when we're talking about legislation and how it impacts transition planning. By now you're probably rightly confused about what age transition services start, but they do start at 16, and so it's not when a student turns 16 that you kind of push in the transition services. It's whether or not the student will turn 16 during the life of that IEP. So let's say that we have our annual IEP in April of a school year. That student's birthday is in January. Since that student will turn 16 before you come back to the table in another year, so if we have it in April, we're not going to meet until April the following year, but that student will have a birthday and turn 16 within that year, within that life of that IEP, you would include transition services. So if your IEP happens every April and the student isn't going to turn 16 until the next May, then you don't have to include transition services in that particular IEP because you're going to meet again before they turn 16. Just some key points about what the other things that changed in the 2004 legislation. It really did talk about coordination of services and using those community resources, not just within the school, but also outside of the school, and bringing in rehabilitation services or bringing in Medicaid if that was the case. So really kind of pulling in community resources. Also the results oriented, so it kind of started focusing less on what is the student doing right now and what's the long-term goal. So let's look out in the future. What do we want to see happen, and then how do we work our way back? So it was a kind of a different approach. In other courses I've talked about that top-down or bottom-up planning. This is a situation where you're really looking at top-down planning. You're kind of looking at big picture first and then kind of whittling your way back to where you are right now. The other thing that was really stressed in the 2004 legislation was focusing on the students' preferences and interests. What does a student want to do? What are they good at? Where do they see themselves? And I think that it's strange to think that we weren't considering this before, but it wasn't always the case. So there was a big push in the 2004 reauthorization to make sure that we were including the student's voice in this transition planning. I mentioned in the previous slide that this was a results-oriented process. So again, it's not just one thing you do. It's not just a little section in the IEP that you can write down and kind of push to the side. This is an ongoing process. This is a process that has to build to this grand kind of finale, if you will. And that finale is the student being able to transition out of school and be a successful member of society in every facet of their life. Other legislation that impacted transition after IDEA, and not chronologically after, but after we've talked about that, are the Rehab Act it was first written in 1973 and then reauthorized in 92, and that provided direct services with people with disabilities to help them become qualified for employment. So state vocational rehab programs were funding trainings. Initially, it was a law against discrimination, and it still does prohibit discrimination by employers, but then it kind of morphed into what is now ADA, which is American Disabilities Act, and that Rehab Act was aligned with ADA. So the Rehab Act provides the services, and then ADA kind of picked up the back end where you cannot be discriminated against by employers if you have a disability. The Perkins Act was a focus on vocational technical education, and that prepared individuals for paid or unpaid employment in occupations that required something other than an advanced degree. Funding was made available to help provide vocational technical education programs and services to both students and young adults. Those funds are typically awarded as grants to state education policies or agencies, so you'll see the money trickle down into the schools for equipment, curriculum materials, materials for learning labs, curriculum development or modification, staff development, hiring vocational staff, remedial classes. And that takes the form of things like culinary education within high schools. So some high schools have specialty programs, and they're strictly for vocational kind of tracks, although we don't use the word tracking anymore. But that would be kind of the culinary program, or the auto mechanics, welding, cosmetology, even some of the nursing programs. All of those would be examples of how the Perkins Act can be used for funding to support those types of programs within schools. There are schools that are exclusively tech ed schools, and then there are public high schools that have individual programs just kind of embedded in them. There was really an attempt to kind of bring in businesses to participate in the workforce development, and today most of the funds go towards those kind of career pathway programs like I was just mentioning. The problem is that there's a lot of other administrative requirements that go along with that, like labor standards, especially if you're looking at certification or accreditation for some of the technical education programs, the monitoring, the reports, the record keeping, all of those sorts of things. So it can get a little complicated, but we've definitely seen a push to help at least fund these programs to provide supports for students who have disabilities and want to go down the vocational education track. When we think about transition services, it's important to remember why it's a key component for students with disabilities. And this is going to be a big change for a lot of students, especially those who have stayed in school until they're 22. They're moving from a very, very structured environment where they know the expectations and people are more or less taking care of them, to the workforce or to kind of the general public where they don't necessarily have one person who is taking care of them, or a teacher leading the way, or someone who's going to solve the problems. These students may stay at home and live with their parents, but that's also a huge burden on their parents, so the expectations change there as well. Transition makes sure that we're taking the steps that are needed for that long-term goal, because we don't want it to creep up and then all of a sudden we don't know what to do. Getting things like Medicaid and using vocational training takes a very long time. It's not as if the student graduates and goes down to an office and applies. It can take years for the paperwork to go through and for students to be able to receive any sort of disability, especially students with severe disabilities, to receive any sort of support. It can take years. So the planning has to start by the time that these students are freshmen or sophomores in high school, or the services just aren't going to be available to them yet by the time that they graduate.